rejoint depuis l'ouverture. Et donc, on va commencer par la première conférence plénière de cette journée. Et je vais passer la main au chairman Johan Léger.
Merci. Merci
Voilà.
Isabelle, j'espère que vous m'entendez bien. Donc, bonjour à tous et bienvenue à cette première conférence plénière des JMC 2021. Donc, j'ai l'honneur de présenter le premier orateur de ces conférences plénières. Après une thèse au département de physique de l'École normale supérieure, au laboratoire Pierre-Hégrin, puis un postdoc au Max Born Institute de Berlin, Guillaume Cassabois a été maître de conférence à l'université Pierre et Marie Curie. Et depuis 2009, il est professeur à l'université de Montpellier, au laboratoire Charles Coulon, où il a commencé à travailler sur le nitrure de bore hexagonal. Donc, avant de le laisser vous expliquer pourquoi c'est un matériau fantastique pour la physique de la matière condensée, laissez-moi vous rappeler de m'envoyer vos questions par chat privé pendant tout le séminaire pour que je puisse les communiquer à Guillaume à la fin de son exposé. Et Guillaume, je me permettrai de te faire un signe après une trentaine de minutes pour te dire d'aller vers la conclusion. Voilà, c'est à toi Guillaume, je t'en prie.
Merci beaucoup Johan. Donc bonjour à toutes et à tous. C'est un très grand plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui, même si c'est un peu frustrant de ne pas être devant vous en présentiel. Je voudrais dire que c'est un très grand plaisir, mais aussi un très grand honneur d'être conférencier plénier aux Journées de la matière condensée. Et c'est l'occasion pour moi de remercier donc l'ensemble de la SFP, le comité de programme et Isabelle Canta et Eric Collet pour l'organisation de cette conférence dans des conditions qui sont délicates avec une conférence qui a été reportée. Quoi qu'il en soit, donc, c'est un très grand plaisir de vous présenter donc, ce sujet du nitrure de bore hexagonal. Et pour la partie scientifique, je vais partager mon écran d'abord, et puis I'm going to switch to English for the scientific part of the presentation. So is it okay, Johan, with the screen sharing? Yes?
Oui, c'est parfait.
Great. So, as mentioned in my abstract and in the conference program, the title of my talk is Hexagonal Boron Nitride. So it's quite a short title. And when I was preparing my talk, I was thinking of an extended version of this title. And I came to the conclusion that hexagonal boron nitride was a kind of a fantastic example of cross-fertilization between material science and condensed matter physics. And in the context of the Journée de la matière condensée, I think it's a kind of prototypical example of how material science can feed a lot of very original physics. I have to say that I used to work I started my career working on semiconductor quantum dots and then carbon nanotubes, focusing on the specific optical techniques, either nonlinear optics or coherent spectroscopy, and trying to find some original nanostructures. And so it was a kind of a holy grail to find new properties coming from the quantum confinement, from the fact that we are dealing with nanostructures. And I have to confess that I had not imagined that I would be able to do such innovative physics with a bulk sample, simply no nanostructure. So, and it's this kind of surprise that was brought by hexagonal boron nitride, and I think it's very important for this conference that the take-home message is that material science is a fantastic source of inspiration for condensed matter physicists. So actually, hexagonal boron nitride is not new at all. I borrowed this picture from a company where you see the name here. This company sells huge amounts of hexagonal boron nitride, so you can buy macroscopic amounts of this white powder. That is known in the industry, and this powder is very useful because it has a low refractive index in the visible, it has a low density, and it has amazing performances at high temperatures, so it is used especially to fabricate this kind of ceramics that can afford extremely high temperatures and that are used in many applications. Hexagonal boron nitride is known as a solid lubricant in an engine. So a very familiar material in the industry and known for a very long time. So what is the microscopic structure of hexagonal boron nitride? So it's very similar to graphite, and it is often called white graphite. So it is made of boron and nitrogen atoms organized in honeycomb lattices. So we have 2D planes made of boron and nitrogen with quasi-covalent binding between these atoms. And hexagonal boron nitride is the vertical stacking of these 2D layers. And in between the layers, there is this weak van der Waals interaction that makes the material 3D. So we have this very strong anisotropy in the binding, in the electronic binding of van der Waals interaction between the layers, and covalent binding within the layers organized in this honeycomb feature. So it's very similar to graphite. It's not completely isostructural to graphite, because in graphite there is a translation from one plane to the other, this familiar AB or Bernal stacking of graphite. In the case of hexagonal boron nitride, the hexagons are perfectly aligned from the centers of the hexagon are perfectly aligned from one layer to the other. So so you see, there's nothing really complicated in hexagonal boron nitride. The boron and nitrogen, only boron and nitrogen, with this very simple crystal structure. And this is actually a long story that started more than 1.5 centuries ago. And what is known to be the first report of the growth of this sp2 hybridized form of boron nitride is this paper, this report of Balmain. And it took 1 century to identify the exact crystallographic structure by X-ray diffraction. And this is the pioneering work of Pease in 1952. But really the important breakthrough came in 2004 with the synthesis of high quality crystals by Watanabe and Taniguchi. And basically, I would not be here today speaking to you about the hexagonal boron nitride without the work of Takashi Taniguchi. So what was realized in 2004 in Japan by Watanabe and Taniguchi was the synthesis of high quality polycrystals. So you have a view graph here of high quality HBN crystals, where you can identify here a single crystal, which is transparent because it has a very high band gap. The scale here is 100 micron. You can buy these polycrystals in the form of these tiny crystals that are of the size of millimeters. And the breakthrough of Watanabe and Taniguchi was to synthesize these small single crystals with of high quality and high purity. So this was demonstrated by cathodoluminescence, as shown here in the panel, where you have the cathodoluminescence spectrum in blue of the high purity crystals of Taniguchi, and in green of the typical samples that were available before the work of Taniguchi. And there is this huge emission around 300 nanometers. So this is very important. Pay attention to the wavelength scale here. We are dealing with the ultraviolet, deep ultraviolet between 200 and 400 nanometers. And before the work of Taniguchi, the luminescence spectrum was dominated by defects emission around 300 nanometers. And Taniguchi managed to grow high quality crystals where the luminescence is basically coming around the band gap with an emission around 2 to 10 nanometers, around 6 electron volts. So we are dealing with a kind of insulator, extremely high band gap, around 6 eV, with a luminescence, intrinsic luminescence around 200 nanometers. And these crystals became really important after the advent of graphene. So here is a picture of Geim and Novoselov, who were awarded the Nobel Prize in 2010 for their discovery of graphene. And hexagonal boron nitride has become a prototypical 2D material together with graphene and molybdenum disulfide, or more generally, transition metal decalcogenides. And what is particularly striking between HBN and graphene is the fact that the lattice constant is basically the same. The relative the lattice constant is different only by a few percent. So it's completely graphene and HBN have appeared as 2D materials that can be combined together because they have both this sp2 hybridization of the electronic levels. And so Geim proposed the word of van der Waals heterostructures, where we can play like Lego bricks and stack different 2D materials of different thicknesses, different composition, with this new field of van der Waals heterostructures. So I guess that most of you in the audience, the one who work with HBN, work with this type of heterostructures, where HBN is a kind of a perfect 2D insulator. And it has become so important in the field of 2D material research that 2 years ago, there was a focus in Nature describing the work of Taniguchi and Watanabe that were called the Crystal Kings. And you have this picture of Watanabe with this crystal making hydraulic press. So it's a huge system because the growth of HBN requires high temperature and high pressure. So you have here an example of what Taniguchi does in his everyday life and to provide the crystals all over the world. But I will show you today that hexagonal boron nitride is much more than a 2D insulator. And coming back to the very beginning of my presentation, the purpose is to show you that we have very amazing properties arising from this specific anisotropic structure. And I will cover briefly today 3 examples, one dealing with the infrared properties, with the hyperbolic properties of hexagonal boron nitride. The second one deals with quantum technologies and the fact that we have single photon emitters that are bright in hexagonal boron nitride. And the third aspect will deal with the ultraviolet, deep ultraviolet properties. So the big surprise with hexagonal boron nitride was that it was a naturally hyperbolic material. So what is hyperbolicity? So here I am presenting the isofrequency surfaces in K-space in a case of an isotropic material. So we have the usual spheres. And these spheres are deformed to ellipsoid if the material is anisotropic. But hyperbolicity refers to the fact that in the material that are anisotropic, but where the sign of their permittivity or dielectric constant is not the same in different directions. So we have the type 1 hyperbolicity, where the dielectric constant is negative along one direction, and type 2, where the dielectric constant is negative along two directions. The fact of having a negative dielectric constant has nothing really special. It is the case in any metal below the plasma frequency. And it gave rise to the field of the development of the field of plasmonic, with the possibility to confine the light at a scale much below the wavelength of the light. But hyperbolicity was a property sought in artificial structures to take advantage of the fact that we can have a negative permittivity to be able to confine the light at a very small scale, but also to take advantage of the full material volume with a positive sign of the permittivity in other directions. So hyperbolicity is a very important property that is sought in artificial structures in the context of nanophotonics, metasurfaces, etc. And in hexagonal bore nitride, it is naturally a hyperbolic material. So I will show you how it derives from the microscopic structure. So here I am plotting the phonon band structure in K-space, and we have different branches. But the reason of interest is this is between the transverse optical and longitudinal optical modes. In any polar semiconductor crystals, there is a splitting between these two modes, between the transverse optics and longitudinal optics, and the width of this the LOTO splitting scales like the oscillator strength of the TO. In hexagonal bore nitride, this mode is infrared active, and the Raman active mode is here, and we have degenerate, and we have this LO mode here. But what is really common in any polar semiconductor is the fact that there is no propagation of light in this energy region, which is called the Reststrahlen band. Basically, if we sense light on a semiconductor crystal, it is basically reflected in this region. So in hexagonal bore nitride, there are two Reststrahlen bands. There is the upper Reststrahlen band in this energy region, but there is also a second one in this other energy region. So you may wonder what is the meaning of this strange naming with ZO, because when dealing with phonons, we have longitudinal and transverse modes. ZO is nothing else than the transverse modes for the atomic vibration along the C-axis. So ZO and TNO are transverse modes where the atoms vibrate either in plane for TO or along the C-axis for ZO. And this is extremely important, and it is a direct consequence of the anisotropy, the fact that the vibrations in the plane and along the C-axis give rise to eigenmodes that are spectrally separated. And if we want to visualize a little bit more, I am plotting here the phonon modes, the transverse optical phonon modes. So in real space, the atoms vibrate out of phase between boron and nitrogen. The neighbors are out of phase. It is this specific feature of optical phonon modes. But all the atoms vibrate in the plane. Whereas if we now switch to this other transverse optical modes, which is called a ZO mode, they vibrate along the C-axis, which means that light will be absorbed for an electric field in the plane in this case. So we will have properties for electric field that is in the plane for this Reststrahlen band, whereas in this case, we will have light absorption by the optical phonons for an electric field that is parallel to the C-axis. So this is the reason why we have hyperbolicity in hexagonal boron nitride. If the material was isotropic, these modes would be degenerate. This Strahlen band will superpose on this one, and there would be no hyperbolicity. Because of the anisotropy, we have this decoupling of the two Strahlen band. And for the lower Strahlen band here, it is a type 1. We have a resonance out of plane. And it is of type 2 for the upper Strahlen band, where the electric field is absorbed in the plane. So this gave rise to many applications, and I have no time to cover today, but this is really a first example of a good surprise, the fact that HBN, because of this anisotropic structure, is a naturally hyperbolic material. But all this is in the mid-infrared. Pay attention to the wavelength between 6 and 14 micron. The second surprise of this material came from the demonstration of very bright single photon sources in hexagonal boron nitride. So the report came in 2015 in a group of Igor Aranovich. In Montpellier, we, with my colleague Vincent Jacques, and we also demonstrated the existence of bright single photon emitters in bulk crystals. So this is a bulk crystal of hexagonal boron nitrides. If we do microscopy, we have a lot of hotspots, and using the usual techniques of quantum optics, by performing intensity correlation measurements, we could demonstrate that these isolated hotspots correspond to single defects that are extremely bright. Here you have the saturation as a function of the optical power. We reach emission counts, about millions of counts per second, which is huge. For those of you who are not familiar with this field, here I have plotted the emission level of a typical NV center. So it is 10 times lower. So single defects in HBN are extremely bright. And the property that has been sought for in the last few years was to find a spin photon interface in hexagonal boron nitride to be able to entangle the state of the photon with a spin degree of freedom in the defect. And without going into the details of this a little bit technical slide, just want to mention that last year there was the report of the first demonstration that the intensity of the optical emission depends on the magnetic field, the microwave frequency, so the typical degrees of freedom that are used experimentally to reach a spin photon interface. And the originality here is that the defect can be extremely bright, emit a lot of photons, and it is available in a crystal that can be as thin as an atomic foil, so basically a honeycomb lattice of HBN. After this second surprise, I'm going to switch to the third one, which is more in the core of the work done in Montpellier in the last few years. And again, I would like to start with very basic physics, condensed matter physics, and to start not now with the phonon band structure, but the electronic band structure as calculated in this paper, where we have the valence band, which has a maximum around the K point, and the conduction band, which has a minimum around the M point. So the gap is quite huge, as I told you before, 6 eV. And if we zoom in, we see a typical configuration of an indirect gap. So in a sense, nothing new in semiconductor physics, in condensed matter physics. This is quite an obvious configuration. What is not obvious at all is the fact that the valence band maximum is not at the zone center in HBN. And it may appear as a small detail, but actually it has dramatic consequences on the optical properties of this material. So we are dealing with an indirect band gap, but where the conduction band minimum and the valence band maximum are at the edges of the Brillouin zone. And I'm going to show you that it has very important consequences. So let's go back to the textbook example of phonon-assisted recombination, not in HBN, but in silicon. In silicon, it's a cubic material. The valence band maximum is the zone center, the gamma point, and the minimum of the conduction band is around the X valley. So to fulfill momentum conservation, one needs the emission of one phonon and the emission of one photon. Very basic example of solid state physics. Phonon-assisted emission in silicon involves a phonon which wave vector matches the momentum difference between the zone center and the valley. What does it mean? It means that to understand the luminescence spectrum of silicon, one has to look for the phonons in the same valley as the conduction band minimum, because the valence band maximum is at the zone center. So the usual game, as I'm writing here, in indirect bandgap materials is to look for phonons in the same valley as the conduction band minimum. And in HBN, it's not the case. So let's go back to the first Brillouin zone of HBN. On the left, I'm plotting again the phonon band structure from a different reference than before. So I told you that the valence band maximum was around the K point. The minimum of the conduction band was at the M point. It means that the phonons for momentum conservation will have a wave vector which connects the M to the K point. If we translate this to the zone center, with basic geometric argument, we see that the wave vector of the phonon is exactly half the gamma K line. So it means that in the phonon band structure, one has to look for the phonons that are in the middle of the gamma K line, no longer at the edges of the Brillouin zone, as was the case for silicon, diamond, germanium, or any other indirect semiconductors. And the big difference is that now we are dealing with phonons with a finite group velocity. And it has also a very important consequence on the luminescence. So the way we could study this in Montpellier a few years ago was to perform two photon spectroscopy in hexagonal boron nitride. I am plotting on the left side the one photon excitation. So in this case, we excite HBN at wavelength around 196 nanometers above the bandgap. We generate carriers above the bandgap. These carriers relax, and then we have the emission of one photon. Here I am plotting the emission spectrum of HBN in the deep ultraviolet on a semi-log scale. So I'm really zooming in the emission close to the band edge. And we recognize some bands and some backgrounds due to the laser emission. To get rid of this stray light, we perform two photon excitation, now using laser light around 400 nanometer. And by absorption of two photons, we can now study the emission spectrum without any stray light coming from the laser. We decouple completely in the spectral domain the emission and the excitation of the semiconductor. And by doing this, we could resolve new lines that was the key to understand the emission spectrum of HBN. So here I am plotting, I have rotated the PL spectrum of HBN compared to the different phonon branches, and it perfectly aligns with the PL spectrum. Basically, this dim emission corresponds to the indirect bandgap, and then we have the emission assisted by this phonon branch, this second one here, the third one here, etc., etc. So we have a series of phonon-assisted lines. At high energy are the lines assisted by the emission of acoustic phonon, and at lower energy, the lines assisted by optical phonon. And this was really the key to the starting point of our understanding of the optical properties of HBN in the deep ultraviolet around 200 nanometer. And so we performed studies by changing the boron isotopes. So we were lucky to have samples from Jim Edgar from Kansas State University, who provided isotopically purified samples. The usual mixture is 20% of boron 10, 80% of boron 11. Nitrogen is almost pure naturally. But Jim Edgar managed to fabricate samples that are isotopically purified. The first characterization was Raman spectroscopy, which is quite obvious because the eigenfrequency scales like the inverse of the square root of the mass. So by changing the mass of the isotope, we can tune the phonon energy. And here you have the Raman spectrum of B10, B11, and B natural. For the lighter isotope, we have the higher energy of the phonon. So this is the first characterization. We have also some narrowing of the line because we suppress isotopic mass disorder, as it is the case in boron nitride with the isotopic mixture. And we then perform PL spectroscopy. So now the scale it's a linear scale, so you may not recognize the spectrum that I've shown before, which were in semi-log scale, but the effect is much nicer in this linear scale, where we have the emission of B11, B10, and B natural samples, where we can see the influence of the isotopic purification. Remember that the photon has an energy which is given by the gap minus the energy of a phonon. So for the lighter element, lighter isotope, B10, the phonons have the higher energy, so the redshift is the largest for B10. So we have this series of spectrum, B10, B natural, B11, showing the effect of isotopic purification on the emission spectrum.
Il te reste à peu près 5 minutes, Guillaume.
Merci. So to sum up what we have done in bulk HBN was to identify the specific optical properties of this material in the deep ultraviolet around 200 nanometer. And I've described the phonon-assisted emission, the isotopic purification. There are other very interesting aspects that I have no time to detail today, which deal with the polarization selection rules, detecting either along the C-axis or on the edges of the sample. The influence of the phonon group velocity is described in this paper. And I would like to mention this completely complementary study performed by electron energy loss spectroscopy by our colleagues in Dresden. The main difference between optical spectroscopy and electron spectroscopy is the fact that the electrons can carry a momentum that is high enough to directly excite the exciton. In the case of the photon, it's not possible because the wavelength of light is too large compared to the atomic distance. But our colleagues managed to really map the excitonic dispersion, and they found the indirect exciton in the middle of the gamma K line, exactly as we had found from optical spectroscopy. So more generally, HBN appears as a perfect candidate for deep ultraviolet optoelectronics. It has a high extraction efficiency, and this is what is usual for indirect semiconductors. Extraction efficiency is high, means that the absorption and the emission do not occur at the same energy, at the same wavelength, and this is due to the fact that they are assisted by phonons. So there is a natural separation, splitting of the absorption and emissions response, and this is very usual in indirect semiconductors. What is extremely unusual is the fact that we have a high internal quantum efficiency, which is usually the case in direct semiconductors. It was the property that was demonstrated in the pioneering work of Taniguchi and Watanabe in 2004. They had compared HBN to diamond. So these are two indirect crystals, approximately with the same band gap. So in the same setup, they observed that there was more than 3 orders of magnitude increase of the signal in the case of HBN. And recently, our colleague in ONERA, in the group of Julien Barjon, managed to quantify this, and they have compared diamond, HBN, and zinc oxide in terms of luminescence efficiency, and they have measured that HBN has a luminescence efficiency comparable to a direct semiconductor as zinc oxide, much higher than diamond, as previously demonstrated in this. A few words to conclude. There are actually much more physics and application with HBN. The one example, neutron detection. B10 is is the element in the periodic table with one of the highest neutron absorption cross section. So HBN is also can be extremely important for solid state neutron detectors. In the application of nano electromechanical systems, HBN can be extremely useful because it is one of the stiffest materials. And it can be extremely useful in the semiconductor industry by using the fact that the interaction between the layers is weak. So this scheme is a little bit complicated, but basically people start from a sapphire substrate, they grow a thin layer of HBN and then the device, and then they flip chip the structure on a foreign substrate, and they take advantage of the weak interaction between the layers to remove the growth substrate. So basically, we can reuse the growth substrate for further epitaxial process by using this HBN as a sacrificial layer. And this leads me to my last slides, where I want to mention that all these fantastic properties originating from this simple crystal structure. Again, there is nothing complicated in a crystal structure of HBN, but still many surprises, new effects, a lot of physics. But if we want to use this, we need to be able to grow large single crystals. And the key for this, and the key for any device, is to control this by epitaxy, which is an industrial process. And this is, we are only at the very beginning. I want to mention the work of this Korean group reported 3 years ago, where they managed to grow wafer scale single crystal of monolayer HBN. So it's only a single layer. We are far from the bulk crystals, but it's very encouraging, and it is really the route to follow if we want to use this amazing material in everyday life, in devices, and not only to do fundamental physics. So I would like to thank my co-workers in Montpellier, our PhD students, Adrien Rousseau, Christine Elias, Fyong Wong, Thomas Pileni, my colleague Pierre Balvin, Vincent Jacques, Bernard Gilles, colleagues in France, Alberto Zobelli in Orsay, Abdelkarim Ouergui in Saclay, obviously crystal growers, so Takashi Taniguchi in Japan, Jim Edgar in the US for the isotopically purified sample, Sergei Novikov for the epi layers I have not mentioned today, and colleagues in Spain for the study of phonons. So with this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to take questions. Thank you.
Merci Guillaume pour cet exposé très riche. J'ai déjà 2 questions dans le chat. La première de Jean-Christophe Le Breton Dans quelle mesure les propriétés remarquables du nitrure de bore hexagonal présentées ici sont-elles dépendantes de la qualité du cristal? Peut-on les observer dans un HBN de moins bonne qualité réalisé par CVD, par exemple?
Ouais, c'est une excellente. Je vais peut-être répondre en français là, pour les questions. C'est une excellente question. Ça dépend ce qu'on veut faire. À l'heure actuelle, il y a des propriétés. À l'heure actuelle, la majeure partie des propriétés qui ont été mises en évidence sur des cristaux massifs ne sont pas encore atteintes dans des couches qui sont fabriquées par épitaxie. Mais il y a des contre-exemples. Il y a des contre-exemples, c'est le fait qu'il y a des propriétés qu'on a pu mettre en évidence. Je n'ai pas eu le temps d'en parler ici, mais au niveau de la monocouche, il y a un gap direct, comme dans les TMD. Et la mise en évidence du gap direct, on a réussi à la faire sur des épitaxies, pas par CVD, mais par MBE. Et parce que c'était trop compliqué à l'époque de faire de la microscopie à 200 nanomètres. Bon, on y arrive depuis, mais et là, c'est vraiment des couches épitaxiées qui nous ont permis de mettre en évidence des propriétés qui, pour les TMD d'habitude, ont été regardées sur des couches exfoliées. Donc, ça, c'est pour la comparaison entre les couches épitaxiées et les cristaux massifs. Ça progresse au niveau de l'épitaxie, mais on n'est pas encore au niveau des propriétés des cristaux massifs. Après, entre les cristaux massifs eux-mêmes, oui, ça dépend des sources de matériaux. Nous, notre premier papier là, qui nous a permis de comprendre ce qui se passait là, dans l'UV profond et la structure un peu inhabituelle du gap indirect, on a fait nos mesures non pas sur des cristaux qui proviennent de Taniguchi, mais qui viennent de HQ Graphene, donc, ou 2D, je crois qu'il y a une qualité équivalente chez 2D Semiconductor. Donc, au niveau des cristaux massifs, oui, il y a des différences de pureté, mais bon, au niveau de la réponse optique, c'est pas essentiel. Je sais que mes collègues qui font plutôt de la physique mésoscopique et qui ont besoin de couches avec le minimum de défauts là, pour leur dispositif, ils arrivent dans certains cas, à privilégier une source plutôt qu'une autre, mais c'est vraiment que ça dépend beaucoup des applications. Bon, en résumé, les cristaux massifs sont en moyenne plutôt de très bonne qualité, quelle que soit la source. Et au niveau des couches épitaxiées, ça progresse, mais on n'en est pas encore au niveau des cristaux massifs. Ceci dit, si on regarde un petit peu en arrière, c'est un peu ce qui s'est passé pour les semi-conducteurs un peu plus classiques. Il y a des semi-conducteurs, enfin les propriétés des cristaux en général, c'est dur de faire aussi bien dans les couches épitaxiées. Mais c'est les couches épitaxiées qui permettent de faire vivre le matériau avec les applications.
D'accord, merci. J'ai également une autre question de Brice Arnaud. Par rapport, je pense, aux sources de photons uniques, il demande quelle est la nature des défauts impliqués, donc peut-être la nature, la composition, et puis est-ce que c'est des défauts profonds ou pas?
Alors, ce sont des défauts assez profonds. Là, je n'ai pas marqué le spectre, mais on fait de la détection dans le visible. Donc, on est à 1 ou 2 électronvolts par rapport à un gap qui fait 6 électronvolts. Donc là, on a affaire à des défauts qui sont très profonds. Les défauts qui ont été mis en évidence au début, là, ou dans nos travaux, là, on connaît. Bon, il y a plusieurs possibilités. Je peux être beaucoup plus précis pour ce défaut-là qui a permis d'observer de l'ODMR, là, Optically Detected Magnetic Resonance, c'est-à-dire une modification de l'intensité de la photoluminescence en fonction du champ magnétique en appliquant des micro-ondes. Là, c'est une lacune de bord. Donc ici, on voit la lacune de bord avec ses premiers voisins en azote. Et donc, ça commence à être bien établi que le consensus est en train de se faire autour de la nature de ce défaut, que c'est vraiment une lacune de bord. Donc, c'est relativement simple. Il faut, une des manières d'obtenir ce défaut, la manière la plus propre, c'est-à-dire celle qui donne les specs d'ODMR avec les structures fines les plus marquées, c'est d'utiliser de l'irradiation neutron, donc ce n'est pas forcément la source la plus facile. Pourquoi? Ben, c'est relié à ce que j'ai expliqué à la fin, hein. Le bord 10, c'est un des éléments de la classification périodique avec la section efficace d'absorption de neutrons la plus élevée. Et donc, en absorbant un neutron, on peut enlever un atome de bord et on crée cette lacune de bord là, qui a des propriétés qui commencent à être étudiées et qui sont extrêmement intéressantes. Donc, bon, voilà. Sur ce défaut-là, je peux être précis. Sur les autres, il y a plusieurs propositions. Mais là, on n'a pas besoin d'une impureté, hein, contrairement au centre NV du diamant où il faut implanter de l'azote. Là, c'est une lacune de bord dans HBM.
D'accord, merci. Et je me permets de poser très rapidement une dernière question de Michele Casula. Est-ce que le calcul de phonons ab initio arrive à bien reproduire les splitting des raies spectrales mesurées en spectroscopie optique?
Oui et non. Oui et non, ça marche plutôt bien, mais il y a encore des choses qui ne sont pas complètement comprises. Donc là, c'est le spectre dans l'ultraviolet profond. On a bien identifié ces raies parce qu'on a les règles de sélection en polarisation. Les phonons acoustiques, là aussi. Les modes qui sont suivant l'axe C, on les a observés en faisant la détection perpendiculairement à l'axe C sur le bord de l'échantillon. Ce qui n'est pas clair encore, c'est ce qui se passe pour ces modes-là. Parce qu'essentiellement, on voit 2 répliques phonons, alors qu'a priori, on en a plutôt 3. On a 3 modes là. Donc, au niveau des énergies, oui, l'accord est satisfaisant. Ce qui manque encore, c'est d'aller un cran plus loin. Mais c'est des choses qui sont en train de se... mettre l'interaction électron-phonon dans les calculs ab initio, c'est quelque chose qui commence à se faire, mais tout n'est pas fait parce que là, on ne comprend pas encore très bien ce qui se passe au niveau de ces 3 branches-là, dont on a la signature que de 2, essentiellement. Donc, ça marche plutôt bien, mais il y a encore des subtilités, et surtout, par rapport au calcul ab initio, la grosse avancée qui a été faite là, ces dernières années, c'est de mettre l'interaction électron-phonon dans les calculs ab initio, par tout un tas de méthodes que je ne saurais vous décrire parce que je ne suis pas spécialiste. Mais il y a des choses assez sophistiquées qui apparaissent. Et de ce point de vue-là, HBM, c'est un peu un système modèle pour voir si les calculs convergent.
Ok, très bien. Malheureusement, on va devoir arrêter là pour les questions. Merci encore pour cet exposé de sciences remarquables. Je vous souhaite à tous une bonne suite de JMC. Voilà.